kind of do Locke and Berkeley. I was fighting with my heat yesterday. There's always this big routine I have to go through to get the heat in gear. I have to do a lot of vacuuming of the spool register and stuff. I ran into a mechanical problem. I'm not sure what it was, but I've been using, well, I have a small house. It's kind of a town size house, but it's an old one. Anyway, so I've been using like an electric heater right now, which doesn't quite do the job. And it reminded me of, I was over, we're going to look at Berkeley. I was actually over in Ireland in 1985, because I'd worked in this area. I didn't finish my doctorate, but my doctorate was in this general area. And so I presented some papers at international conferences over the years. And if you're working in the Scottish reaction to British empiricism, then when you have conferences, they're generally overseas. Well, anyway, I remember I was still suffering from jet lag. And it was like I forget if it was it wasn't the evening I got in, but it was the next day. There's this big room, right, where they're going to kind of hold the initial morning paper. And in the British Isles, they're not big on central heat, right? So here's this big room. And it's August, but normal temperatures are like in the 50s in August there. This is in Dublin, Ireland, Trinity College, right, in Dublin. And I mean, talk about a shock to the system. So we're sitting in this big room, and the only heat they could come up with, it's in the morning, right? Everything's cold. Is this like heater, electric heater, about so for a room that seats about 200 people, right? I mean, does not do the job. And talk about a shock to the system. I think one of you mentioned that it seemed like we had gone from summer right into winter without a fall. I talked to my neighbor on the way to my car this morning, and he agreed. Well, at any rate, in Charlottesville, Virginia that year, it was really hot. And a fellow graduate student and I were renting a townhouse. But we were kind of economizing, so we were trying to go with fans and not trying to put the central heat on, because it was expensive, you know. Not the central heat, but the central air. So I'm packing sweaters with sweat dripping off of me upstairs in this townhome, because it's 104 degrees outside. Well, you can imagine the shock to the system. I leave Charlotte's, well, really Baltimore, and 6 hours later, and it's 100 degrees. 6 hours later, and that's what my body is used to. 6 hours later, I landed in Dublin, and it's 59 degrees. You know, I mean, real shock to the system. So I'm sitting there in this big hall with no heat, suffering from jet lag, and it wasn't the best morning of conference. I was glad that I wasn't on that morning. But anyway, to finish up Locke, to really understand, if you look at what's going on in the slide, you can really kind of see, and by the way, the occasion for the conference, I think Berkeley was born in 1885. I'm not a big person on dates. and not 1685. So I think it was the 300th anniversary of Berkeley's birth, you know. And again, Berkeley, when he's writing this stuff, is about 21, you know. He wrote his best stuff when he was a very young man. To understand Berkeley and how it is that somebody in his right mind can try to convince us that there is no material world, that everything is mental. If you understand, go back to Locke, and for us, a telephone, as we experience it, is just a combination of its primary and secondary qualities or properties. Well, basically, Berkeley's strategy in a little book called Three Dialogues Between Hylas and Philanus. That was one of the books at the University of Virginia that we had students read in an introductory philosophy course. And Berkeley's strategy is first to agree with Locke that the secondary qualities of an object are subjective and mind-dependent. And Berkeley repeats some of Locke's arguments, and he comes up with arguments of his own to reinforce Locke's claim that secondary properties are not in things as they are in the world, but they're in us. But then, what Berkeley tries to do is to go on and provide very similarly structured arguments to show that the primary properties are also subjective and mind-dependent. Well, wait a second. If an object like, you know, the cup on the desk or the telephone is nothing but a combination of its primary and secondary properties, and now the primary properties as well as the secondary are subjective and mind-dependent, well, that means the whole thing is subjective and dependent on a mind. And so the whole thing that we experience as an independently existing material object becomes subjective and just a collection of sensations. So if you keep in mind this, you can see how Berkeley can argue from where Locke is to the claim that everything is subjective and mind-dependent. Now, we saw how much Locke's view separates us from the real world, because we perceive a world where things have primary and secondary properties, but for Locke, it's only the primary properties that are in, say, the telephone as it exists in the world. The secondary are mind-dependent and in us. Well, we saw that this is called indirect realism. In other words, what we're acquainted with, you know, only 5 of us in the room, like you and I think, you know, the uneducated vulgar meaning the ordinary person, the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible was the Bible for the ordinary person. You know, we don't mean vulgar in the sense of crass or you know, but ordinary people think that when we're looking at the coffee cup here, we're all looking at one and the same thing numerically. But with a view like Locke says, that's not what's going on. What's going on is that if there are 5 of us in this room, there are 5 private pictures that represent one public object. But what the mind is immediately acquainted with is not things in the external outside world, but with its own private image. And I tried to illustrate by that story about buying the VCR and how they demonstrated the TVs, that the problem with Locke's view is that you can never, in principle, get beyond your immediate inner perceptions to relate them and reconfirm them with the world. In other words, as I said, well, how could you tell that those big projection TVs represented the doll accurately and represented the colors accurately? Well, you'd look at the doll seated on the chair that the camera was aimed at, and you'd look at the picture on the TV and compare them. Well, in a view like Locke's, the inner mind is only acquainted with the picture on the TV. It can never get beyond it to compare our inner experience of the world with the real world out there to confirm that, as Locke does believe, that we have an accurate representation of things in the world. And similarly, and this is how it can lead to Berkeley, as I said, one day I came there and there were pictures of the doll on the TVs, but there wasn't any doll seated in the chair. They were playing a tape. And on a view like Locke's, and this is why it led to Berkeley and to the skepticism of David Hume, not only can you not get behind your immediate experience of the world to confirm that it accurately represents the world out there existing independently from us, but in other words, you don't know if my inner picture accurately represents the coffee cup, but you don't even know for sure that there's a coffee cup there, that the sensations are not the whole thing. Now that's where Berkeley is going. For Berkeley, there's not the gap between us and an external material world, but the sensations are the real thing. Now you say, well, doesn't that mean that he's got a skeptical view about the existence of the material world? And it's fun to read Berkeley try to whittle out of the claim that he's a skeptic. And Berkeley says, wait a second, what is a skeptic anyway but somebody who doubts of the existence of things? And Berkeley says, I'm not doubting the existence of the material world. I'm just telling you straight off there is no material world. There's no doubt in my mind about it. So I'm not a skeptic. I'm not doubting the existence of the material world. I'm just affirming that there is none apart from us. So for Berkeley, there only are the perceptions. And so he doesn't like this, the fact that the indirect realism of Locke sets up a logical gap it's very hard to bridge between the world as we experience it and the world as it is. For Berkeley, the world simply is the world as we experience it, but what we immediately experience is mental. So for Berkeley, everything is mental and consists either of minds or the experiences, the ideas and perceptions and sensations in minds. And we saw basically that one of the things that Berkeley has an additional agenda here. What he's trying to do is also provide an apologetic for Christianity, basic Christianity. And Locke did write at least one book on Christianity and Christian belief, and he was some sort of a Christian. I'm not sure exactly where he fit in. I think some sort of a Protestant Christian, but and I suppose a Church of England. but at any rate, but Berkeley was very devout. Later became a bishop in the Church of Ireland, and he again didn't like the idea that. Well, he thought, you know, we have this cliche, if you give somebody an inch, they'll take a foot. Well, he thinks that that's the danger. Once you allow somebody to think that there's an independently existing material world, a world of material objects that exists apart from us, and is going to go on existing even if we stop existing. Berkeley's afraid that you can go from there to a view like Thomas Hobbes held, that not only is there a material world, but the material world is all there is. That there's no such thing as spiritual substance like Descartes and Locke thought, that that basically and if that's the case, well, what of our immortal soul? I mean, not there, right? We're not a dual entity if you're a materialist in that sense. What of God? Well, if God is claimed to be a spirit, and there's a biblical verse that says God is a spirit and those who worship him need to worship him in spirit and in truth. Well, if God is held to be a spirit, and there is no spiritual substance, then there is no God around either. So it's this kind of view that Berkeley, as a pretty devout Christian, is trying to react against. And what he's trying to do is basically cut the legs out from under the stool of the materialists. In other words, they're using the belief that there's an independent material world to justify their atheism. And what he wants to do philosophically is cut the legs out from the stool that they're standing on from under them by showing that there is no such thing as a material world, and that what does exist is intimately and forever dependent on God for its existence. So you can't cut God out of the picture. In other words, if there's a world of independently existing material objects, you can claim they're out there, whether you or I are there and whether God's around. But Berkeley wants to show that God can't be taken out of the picture. So Berkeley renounces indirect realism. He says, well, we do experience the real world as it is. We have direct knowledge of physical objects, but all these physical objects are collections of sensations and perceptions. In other words, the coffee cup is a collection of ideas of the qualities that make it up. You know, and the same thing for the telephone in the picture. So the world that we experience around us is the world that common sense puts us in touch with, is for Berkeley a world that's ultimately mental. And it's also fun to read Berkeley try to convince you that his view that there is no material world and that everything is mental is basically the common sense view that we all should adopt. You know, and, you know, would we really be on board with that? So there aren't any physical objects existing independently of minds for Berkeley. And this is a long quote. And by the way, when I was in Ireland, we visited the remains. They called it a castle, but it was hardly that. It was more like a big home. But the ruins of Berkeley's family home where he grew up in Cloyne, County Cork in Ireland, about 50 miles from Dublin. It's this kind of beautiful scene. I mean, it's farmland, pastures. It overlooks a small river. Really beautiful scene where but the home was, for the most part, in ruins. I mean, just kind of, there was a big tower-like structure and then some side rooms, but a lot of it was broken up. But they were they had a project undergoing where they were going to try to restore it, and I don't know whatever happened there. I never followed up on that. But here's a quote from Berkeley. But Berkeley's view can be summarized. Remember with Descartes we had, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum, as the phrase that we most usually associate with him. Well, for Berkeley, it's this Latin phrase, esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. That to be is to be perceived by some mind or other. And, you know, I was trying to explain how he gets there, but here's a quote where Berkeley sums up his view. And he says, "It's indeed an opinion strangely prevailing amongst men," not just males, right? Men in the generic sense. "Amongst men that houses, mountains, rivers, all sensible objects," that is, all the objects that you and I come in contact with every day and our five senses alert us to, that all these have an existence distinct from their being perceived by the understanding. This was Descartes' view, right? For Descartes, there's an independent material world existing independently of the material mind. Certainly the ancients thought that, and this was Locke's view. That while the understanding is immediately acquainted with its immaterial perceptions and sensations, they relate to a world distinct from it, a real material world. This is why Locke is called a realist. He's called an indirect realist because he says we don't perceive that real world directly, but indirectly through a sort of the intermediation of ideas. We first perceive ideas, a picture of the cup, but that represents the real cup in the real world for Locke. And so Berkeley knows that a lot of people have this view that Locke has. But Berkeley says, what are the aforementioned objects but the things we perceive by sense? And what do we perceive by sense besides our own ideas or sensations? Here we get what the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid referred to as the theory of ideas. In other words, that the mind is immediately acquainted not with things in the external world, but with its own inner ideas and sensations, and they have to represent things in the world. But now here's how Berkeley goes on. He says, and what do we perceive besides our own ideas and sensations? And is it not plainly repugnant that any of these should exist unperceived? Now, to understand this last sentence, you need to understand something that was really emphasized by philosophers in the mid-20th century when I was in grad school. Well, as I said, his strategy is to agree with Locke that secondary properties are mind-dependent and subjective, but then he goes on to provide additional arguments to show that even the primary properties are. Well, if the whole thing, the whole telephone or the whole cup, is a complex of sensations, and sensations can't exist without a mind to sense them or perceive them, then the cup or the telephone can't exist without a perceiving mind. So he tries to show that the primary is subjective. And to understand Berkeley's claim here, when he says, isn't it repugnant that any of these should exist without a mind? The thing that 20th century philosophers try to point out is that all the qualities of a perceived object are qualities that he sees on an analogy with something like pain. Now, I mentioned sometimes I get a pain in my shoulder because I wiped out on my motorcycle trying to race Charles Jockle down San Martin Drive, a very windy street by Hopkins. He was a near genius, and I was pretty bright, but being pretty bright doesn't insulate you from doing stupid things as a teenager. Anyway, but think about it. Would it make any sense at all to say, well, a pain exists. There's a pain around, but there's nobody around who's feeling that pain at the moment or having that pain, but nonetheless it's around. I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all, does it? To say a pain exists, but there's nobody around to feel it. Well, Berkeley would say, well, okay, but what is a pain but a sensation in the mind? But he says, aren't all these other things that we call qualities nothing but sensations in the mind? The black color of this, its circular shape on top, its hardness, its coolness to the touch. Aren't all of these? In other words, for Berkeley, he would say, aren't all the qualities of what we call a material thing only sensations in the mind? And if we wouldn't want to say that a sensation like pain has an existence apart from its being felt or perceived by a sentient being, somebody capable of feeling pain, Berkeley would say, why would we want to say things like colors or sensations of hardness or taste or a perception of roundness? Why would we want to say that those sensations exist apart from a perceiving mind? So do you see where Berkeley is going this? That's how he gets to esse percipi. To be is to be perceived by some mind or other. Now, so for Berkeley then, as I say in this slide, it makes no sense to say that sensible qualities like colors, sounds, taste, feelings of warmth, or hardness, and perceptions of shapes have an existence, though there's no mind perceiving them. Just like it doesn't make any sense to say there's a pain that exists, even though there's nobody around to feel it. Now, you might be thinking, isn't this like the question, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound if there's nobody to hear it? Yeah, and this is kind of Berkeley's view. Now, part of Berkeley, so for him the world's ultimately mental and consists of only one kind of stuff, mental stuff, which is either minds, our mind, or as it turns out, God's mind, or ideas and sensations in minds, which are also mental. Now, Berkeley makes a distinction. Think of it this way. I could tell you all, look, imagine a horse. Imagine a black horse. Now, put that aside for a minute and imagine a unicorn, a totally white unicorn. And you can do that, right? Or I can say, well, I want you to remember back on breakfast this morning, if you had breakfast, and what you ate. Well, you can call up memories at will. right, of what you had for breakfast. You can remember back. Or you can call up not memories, but an imagination of a horse or of a unicorn. In other words, Berkeley would say there are some ideas we have that are subject to our will, that we can, control. But now, if I walk forward here, I don't have any choice about whether or not I'm going to run into a table, right? Now, for Berkeley, this is just a collection of ideas. But for Berkeley, the difference between ideas that are subject to my will and ideas that aren't is that, in part, this table is God's idea. I'm sort of perceiving God's idea with God of the table. So God is around to guarantee that these tables are here when you and I are gone. And there's a wonderful little humorous poem that a student of Bertrand Russell wrote. I think his name was Ronald Nash. That goes something like this. In other words, you could say, well, what if God saw that the tables and chairs really exist when we're not there? Or that the tree is there when we're not around? Wouldn't this prove your view false, Berkeley? And so Ronald Nash's poem goes something like this. There was a young man. Let me get over here. Ronald Nash's poem goes something like this. There was a young man who said, God must think it exceedingly odd if he sees that the tree continues to be when there's no one about in the quad. And the response is, sir, your astonishment's odd. I'm always about in the quad. And that's why the tree will continue to be, because perceived by yours faithfully God. So this is Berkeley's view. In other words, you can't drop God out of the picture on his view because it's God that continues, that guarantees the continued existence of what we call the material world is just perceiving the ideas of God's mind. So that's basically Berkeley's view. So can you see how somebody in his right mind can nonetheless claim that there is no material world, that everything is ultimately mental? How does this strike you when you hear something like this? I mean, Berkeley is very slick. I try to say that he will talk you out of your wallet, I mean, because he's certainly trying to convince us of something that most of us, of a view that most of us do not have, that everything's ultimately mental. And, well, I mentioned that Berkeley tries to persuade us that the primary qualities are also, the word is mind-dependent. In other words, mind-dependent is dependent on a mind for its existence. In other words, he says if the world as we experience it is nothing but a complex of sensations, you can't have sensations existing without a mind there to have them or perceive them. And so the entirety of what we call the real world is basically dependent on a mind, either our mind or God's mind, for its existence. And how does he get this? Well, again, he tries to convince us that what we think of as a material object is just a collection of sensations, that the primary qualities as well as the secondary ones are subjective and mind-dependent. I mentioned that I wiped out racing Charles Jockle down San Martin Drive. When I was a teenager, these Hondas, little motorcycles from Japan, Hondas were very popular, and I had one. And one argument that Berkeley uses comes awfully close to relativity theory. Now I'm not claiming that Berkeley discovered the theory of relativity or anything close to that, but motion in space was a primary quality for Locke. Now, the reason I'm bringing up the motorcycle is this was a little high to 90, and you had to wind that thing out for all it was worth to do 55 or 60 on the expressway back then. But I would really notice the difference if I was like driving on the expressway and then I'd pull off onto Falls Road where the speed limit was 25. And you really notice the difference. In other words, 25 miles an hour after you were going 55 or 60 on your motorcycle, and I think the speed limit was 60 back then, seemed very, very slow, right? But Berkeley brings up this point to say that you think motion in space, Locke, is a primary quality and not subjective. And Berkeley says, look, motion is subjective in this way. It seems different to different perceivers. So it's not objective in the way Locke thinks it is. Number. In other words, if I ask you, well, how many coffee cups are sitting up here, coffee mugs or whatever, everybody would say, well, there's one on your desk. In other words, Locke would say the coffee mug, as it is in the real world, there's one coffee mug. That's the number. So number is a primary property that's not subjective and in us. But Berkeley says, well, wait a second, consider a yardstick. And remember, this is a British system. They have feet and inches and yards rather than centimeters, which was more the European, French-initiated system. Berkeley says, well, what number should we associate with the yardstick? Should we associate the number 1 as in 1 yard, or 3 as in 3 feet, or 36 as in 36 inches? Berkeley says, doesn't this show that number is relative to the perceiver and not a primary quality? So these are the kinds of arguments that Berkeley uses. And I put this one in the slide. It's kind of an odd argument, but I put this one in the slide. This is from his 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philoneus. Hylas is a word for substance. He has Locke and Descartes' view that there's a real material world, and Philoneus is the lover of knowledge or wisdom, who takes Berkeley's view of immaterialism or idealism. And we do call Berkeley's view idealism with an L, just because it sounds better in English than ideaism, which doesn't roll off the tongue very well. But this argument, note how it parallels the water argument. In other words, size. Locke would say size is a primary property of the cup as it really is, even though the black color is subjective and in us. My perception of the cup accurately represents its size for Locke. And that's a primary quality of the cup as it really exists in the world. But Berkeley says, well, wait a second. Let's consider something like a dust mite. We only have, and I'm going to quit after this slide. He says the size of a mite's foot would be extremely small to us because a dust mite is about the size of a period, right? You can barely see one with a naked eye. But he says, relative to the mite's foot would be ordinary size. And they knew, they had microscopes back then, they knew there were one-celled organisms like microbes. If you had a germ, a microbe, on the mite's foot would seem absolutely huge. So he says, what is the size of the mite's foot? Is it extremely small, ordinary size, or absolutely huge? Well, note how this parallels the water thing about is the water cold or hot. But he says he can't have the mite's foot being both small and large at the same time, having contradictory properties. So Berkeley says what Locke thought was a primary quality, namely size, is not an objective property of the mite's foot, but subjective and relative to the perceiver. So Berkeley says it's a mind-dependent property, size, just like motion and number, which Locke thought were primary qualities. He says are also subjective and mind-dependent. And I say in the slide, note that this parallels the water argument for secondary qualities. So, to sum things up, he provides similar arguments to show that primary qualities are mind-dependent. But if physical objects are nothing but a combination of their primary and secondary qualities, and Locke and Berkeley both agree the secondary are mind-dependent, and Berkeley argues that the primary are, then that means the entire object is mind-dependent and dependent on a perceiver, either us or God. Esse est percipi. To be is to be perceived. To exist is to be perceived by some mind or other. So objects are dependent for their existence on minds, either our mind or God. Okay, well look, have a great weekend. We do have class on Monday, but not on Wednesday. But hopefully we'll see. I'm going to go into some of Locke's political theory before we go to Hume. But take care. Have a great weekend. Thanks for showing up. I'll mark you all down as present. I know who is here. And thanks very much for coming. We'll see you.